I'm very grateful that you've all come out to hear me talk about why art matters to the humanities. My name is David Rodowick. I'm a sophomore at the university. I'm just starting my second year here, having come most recently from Harvard. And I'm a professor in the departments of cinema and media studies with an association in visual arts. Hence, this topic is very important to me. I'm not going to, the name of the talk is Why Art Matters to the Humanities. I'm not going to give you all the reasons why I think art matters to the humanities, but I will give you just a few, especially the topic of why conversations about the arts have a central place in the humanities. And I'll also be talking mostly about the visual arts, which is my area. Not only as a teacher, my background was basically in the philosophy of art, with specialties in the history of aesthetics, philosophy of art, the history of film theory and film and philosophy. But also, I'm happy to say I'm also an artist. You're actually looking at one of my own works up here, because at the beginning of my talk, you might wonder what some of my works look like. I picked this one, because it's silent, so I can just talk over it while people look at it behind me. But also because it's a work called Judgment, which is one of my key themes today for how we talk about aesthetic judgment. Just a few beginning words, and I want to make a few personal remarks before I get into the meat of my talk, is that I've always been very curious at the why there might be a question about why art matters to the humanities. These problems go back a very long way in the history of philosophy. I would say all the way back to the 18th century, especially German aesthetics, where just roughly speaking, as aesthetics began as a philosophical discipline, a contrast was struck between word and image, with words being thought about and writing being thought about as a conceptual and rational language, but as distinct from images as a non-conceptual and perhaps non-rational or irrational language. And this distinction between words and images is going to be one of the problem points today, but we're going to be talking about more. This was always a problem for me because from the very beginning of my academic career, I was a graduate student studying philosophy and film studies, but I was also a quite active film and video artist. And my research then and now was considered to be highly abstract and theoretical, as oddly were my films and videos. Nevertheless, this creative work was shown and still is shown widely in festivals, galleries, and university screenings, even won some awards. But at this point in time, 30 years ago when I began, and even now speaking to you here, I never saw any real difference between my theoretical work, my philosophical work on the one hand, and my artistic work on the other. For me, they were always two sides of the same process, two ways of thinking, if you were, and thinking through specific kinds of materials. It might be philosophical concepts in my books. It might be thinking through the materials of video and camera technologies. And indeed, both these sides, my left brain and my right brain, I was trying to think through certain problems of medium, time, duration, reproducibility, and the aesthetic limits of technology, and the relation between concept and expression. Now, all this sounds very abstract, and indeed it is a bit. But the moral is, once again, that I saw no difference between my so-called academic research and my creative activity in projected images. For me, they were two means of expression for a single thought process. Now, that is a brief introduction to the problem, and now I want to give, because I've also, God help me, been a university administrator for a very long time, especially in Harvard, where I spent 9 years in the oddly named Department of Visual and Environmental Studies, which is how Harvard calls its studio art department. And I was also director for the Carpenter Center for the Visual Arts, where I served as a resident philosopher, as well as brought in to create a new PhD program in film and visual studies. One happy consequence of this move was that within the department, at least, the idea that a philosopher was seriously working as an artist was seen as natural. You know, why wouldn't I in the art department be working as an artist? And why would it matter that I was a philosopher? It was a very welcoming place. About the same time that I was at Harvard, a big change happened, which is among the many reforms I was able to establish with my colleagues, was to begin hiring both junior and senior artists into tenure track appointments, leading to, permanent tenure at the university. The Carpenter Center had been around for 50 years, and this was actually a fundamentally new thing. Because for those 50 years, from 1963, the Carpenter Center, which if you don't know is in-house in this beautiful building, it's the only built structure by the great Swiss architect Le Corbusier, which looks like a spaceship that landed right on the Harvard campus. For 50 years, it was considered something like a parallel world that the rest of the campus, and especially the humanities, weren't paying much attention to. But suddenly, when it became a question of tenuring artists within the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, a whole set of sort of interesting problems began to occur that, of course, for me were administrative problems, but also problems that interest me as a philosopher, which is the question being raised are, can the creative arts be counted as research? I'm happy to say at Chicago, this is not as big a problem. I'm looking over at some artist colleagues to see if they agree with me. At least it's not a bigger problem as it was at Harvard. For me, it was, of course, creative arts count as research, but I found a great deal of resistance to this that made me start thinking about, since we're talking about very educated people in the humanities, what are the kinds of arguments that people have in their head that might be resistant to the idea that at a research university, the creative arts would count as research. And this was all the more paradoxical because the current president of Harvard, Drew Faust, in 2008 presented a new task force on the arts at Harvard that was trying to make a case to bring the creative arts and all their manifold activities into the university and its curriculum. And we also had a very sympathetic dean, herself a literary scholar, but very sympathetic to what we were doing in the visual arts. Now, as I said, for 50 years, the Carpenter Center went more or less ignored, and because no one seemed to seriously confront the fact of what it might mean to fully integrate the visual arts into the humanities. Artists seemed to come and go, but once it was seen that they were going to stay, that they would be tenured in the university and serving on committees who were trying to develop procedures and protocols for promoting artists and promoting them to tenure, I began to notice a number of puzzling misconceptions on the part of humanists concerning the place of artists in their work. And this is what I'm going to talk about today. Despite my faith in the intelligence and goodwill of my humanist colleagues, I was surprised and then perplexed by a new variant of C.P. Snow's two cultures argument. This gulf of miscomprehension, you don't have to look at my work anymore. We're going to look at Magritte a little while, and I'll return to this image in a second. This gulf of miscomprehension and miscommunication was now open not just between the sciences and the humanities, but between the humanities and the arts. The idea that somehow there was two cultures, one of which was humanistic research, one was creative practice in the visual arts. And of course, in our current culture, there is another danger, which is the opposite of what Snow imagined in his time. This is what the British philosopher P.M.S. Hacker calls scientism, as the inappropriate extension of the methods and forms of explanation of the natural sciences to domains of humanistic inquiry. Scientism is a pervasive and popular attitude in today's research universities, though I'm happy to say it's more attenuated here than other places I've been. In its purest form, scientism is committed to an exclusive methodological unity that constricts standards of knowledge to explanations that are primarily causally based and subsumable to what scientists call covering laws or general laws. A fancy term for this, which you can take away and use in cocktail conversations now, is methodological monism, which means that there is only one pathway to rational explanation. Methodological monism insists that there's only one pathway Only one way of doing research, only one pathway to rational explanation and rational knowledge. And that this pathway, meaning the scientific method, should be universally applicable, regardless of the research domain to which it is applied. Another way of characterizing scientism is to describe its commitment to what I call in my work naturalizing epistemologies. And in this view, knowledge becomes more epistemologically secure the more it focuses on cross-cultural regularities that are grounded in the body and in the brain, physiologically speaking, and in automatic processes that are impervious to human introspection and belief. A naturalizing epistemology demands that the more a process is involuntary, like reflex, that the more the process is involuntary, that is, and closed to conscious introspection or close to self-reflection, the more it gains in epistemological value, right? And so what we usually value in the humanities, introspection, self-reflection, is closed to this kind of methodology, which is indeed very popular in new domains in the humanities like evolutionary psychology and cognitive psychology, as well as the quantitative or digital humanities. Alternatively, what needs to be clarified and defended in what I like to call a philosophy of the humanities are forms of reason whose practices are founded on the very quality of being open to introspection and self-reflection and communicating that introspection. And all that is asked for here is that human agents be capable of intentional reflexive acts, and through these acts be capable of undergoing change and of understanding, say, artistic artifacts in new ways and in new contexts. Now, when I myself sit on these tenure committees, if someone comes from, say, pure mathematics or astrophysics, I happily admit that I don't know enough mathematics to judge those kinds of cases, though I think I do know quite a bit about the philosophy of science, and happily assert a sort of modesty around those subjects and listen carefully to external evaluations and so forth. I might feel more comfortable, of course, in a case on literature, although literature isn't my area either. It's philosophy and moving images. But nonetheless, I feel constrained to a certain modesty to only join the conversation at a certain level. What I was struck by in tenure cases involving artists was that almost everybody at the table, I hope I'm not dishing on Harvard too much here, but almost everybody at the table, whatever their discipline, felt endowed with a capacity for judging art, unconstrained by the modesty by which they might limit their evaluations to other kinds of intellectual activities. And secondly, despite widely varied and distinct assumptions about methods and aims of their disciplines, humanists and scientists alike seem to feel that only with difficulty could the arts be admitted to a community of rational inquiry. So it comes back to this question that was continually asked: how can the arts be considered a research activity, much less sometimes a rational activity? Very curious question. And here I'm trying to target for discussion too often unremarked prejudices about the visual arts in research universities. And in my travels around the country, when I visit art programs in research universities, I do find many interesting variants of these unremarked prejudices. The first is that somehow the arts do not belong among the activities of a research community engaged in thoughtful and rational discussion. And secondly, experiencing the irony of colleagues who feel ill at ease with the prospect of judging the accomplishments of artists as members of a research community, yet feel quite confident in their capacity to do so. That is, unconstrained by the modesty that they might have a humanist in front of a thesis on astrophysics or string theory or what have you. Let me give an account of what I think are some of these unexamined assumptions underlining many humanist and sometimes scientist attitudes towards the visual arts. And despite the fact that most humanists, of course, spend their time interpreting and evaluating critical work, although mostly literary work. Assumption number one is the idea that the evaluation of art is open to anyone without any special critical, conceptual, or historical training. Partly right, but nonetheless a prejudice we'll explore. A related idea is that art can be judged independently and autonomously without the aid of either experts or specially acquired knowledge. Well, partially right, and we'll talk about why in a second. And the third difficult idea that I've been talking about is that art cannot be considered research in an academic context. In other words, there's an assumption that there is no rational preparatory activity, whether conceptual or historical, there is no rational preparatory activity, whether conceptual or historical, required to create works of art. My friend Jessica Stockholder's eyebrows probably went up like this right now, because of course there is, right? But there is assumption on the people who don't know the activities of the studio that this might indeed be the case. And one might indeed wonder if someone holds that idea, whether they think thinking is involved in the making of art at all. But of course it is, as I just asserted with my own works. It's making art is thinking by other means and with other materials. But there's resistance to this sometimes in the humanities. And indeed, a continually open question in my 9 years of Harvard is whether and where the creative arts actually belonged in the humanities curriculum, right? And could be counted as research at a major research university. Now, my view is that, as an administrator, was that there's virtually no difference in evaluating artists and researchers, right? But I don't need to go down that path, and we can talk about it if you like. But I want to come back to say that, and this is what I'll use my remaining time to talk about, is that being involved in these meetings, I became very interested in thinking about the paradoxical nature of our critical conversations about art. Of course, it's one of the oldest problems in the history of aesthetics, was thinking about the nature of our conversations about art and the kinds of problems and paradoxes and ironies that often arise in those conversations. There's another unanswered question here about why reading the visual arts amplifies these problems more than conversations about literature or music. Visual art, while I'm talking about this, I hope some people got to go see the wonderful Magritte show at the Art Institute. This is a painting from '35, the red model, Le Modèle Rouge, by the great Belgian artist René Magritte. And I might come back and talk about it a little bit, because I had an interesting conversation around this painting that I might use as an example in a few seconds. Visual art presents us with a kind of apparent immediacy, though not without the impression of transparency. This might mean that we have too much unearned confidence in the idea of being visually literate, or being able to immediately comprehend or take on a visual image. Most humanists are textually literate to high degrees, and even difficult music can seem to be immediately present and transparent or comprehensible to us. Our degrees of literacy might be highly variable in each of these domains, textual, musical, or visual, but there is something about the apparent immediacy of the visual that inspires unreasonable confidence in even highly educated individuals. Since the time of Kant, philosophy has taught us that one of the great pleasures of aesthetic judgments, but also one of its paradoxical difficulties, is that everyone takes an interest in art, and that our individual subjective judgments about art are made as if demanding universal assent. Now, as I talk about that, I brought I hope it's big enough to read, another image for you just to look at while I'm talking about this. This is a perplexing book that I love from 1925 by a man named F.W. Ruckstall called Great Works of Art and What Makes Them Great. It's here as an example of aesthetic judgments, taking 4 classic images from the history of early modernism in the 20th century, and you can see that Mr. Ruckstall has some pretty interesting opinions, judgments about these artworks. For example, King and Queen by Duchamp, lunacy or charlatanism in art, find the couple, look for them, And also Brancusi's Princess Bonaparte, an insolent piece of abstract symbolism and lechery in art. So it's it's an example of someone who's the history of art, passed other judgments on these works. But the interesting thing to note here is it's not that Ruckstuhl is wrong about these arts. We can't empirically say he was wrong. This was his opinion. So the first thing to say is that there is no right or wrong in aesthetic judgment. There's basically argument. And even a quite, reactionary opinion like this one has to be part of the conversation. And the second thing I'll be talking about is the way in which, even though Ruckstuhl is not here with us, a judgment like this is always given as a singular opinion, but one that seems to ask for universal agreement. Kant is very interested in this paradox that our opinions are always subjective and singular, but in their rhetoric ask that everyone sees that this is an insolent and lecherous piece of art. There's this assumption that the visual image is going to read to everyone as Ruckstuhl reads it. So I'll let you play with that for a while while I talk about this philosophically. Perhaps another way to look at this problem is to ask, what is the nature and value of the conversations inspired by works of art? And why are informed conversations about the arts meaningful to us? And what can the arts tell us about interpretation and evaluation as two activities of central concern to the humanities? And I'm really interested in, say, conversations about art as a philosopher, because across the humanities, there's many different methods for doing it and many different contexts, but basically what we do is interpret and evaluate, and to look more deeply and conceptually what those activities mean in our research and our teaching. Stanley Cavell is one contemporary philosopher who's made a powerful case for the presence of the arts and creative activity within the conversations of the humanities. And early in his published work, one of Cavell's main concerns was to restore the claim of reason to aesthetic judgments. And one of Cavell's most original strategies was to revisit, in the context of our ordinary language, Kant's own examination of the paradoxical quality of aesthetic conversation that I was just talking about. As I said, on the one hand, aesthetic judgment is expressed as an assessment that is at once subjective and disinterested. Disinterested meaning that, outside of context, I can make a judgment and it's going to have value. Or it's not a value that is influenced by a particular ideology or outside value system. So an assessment that is at once subjective and disinterested, and often as if in an inward conversation with oneself. On the other, such judgments are voiced outwardly as if claiming universal assent from all others within range of their hearing. In other words, aesthetic judgments often take the form of being singular and personal, yet one assumes that since they are a universally human capacity, they are capable of soliciting universal agreement about that judgment. Of course, no peaceful conversation elicits more disagreement than interpretations and evaluations of art. And at the same time, disagreements about art, about what we see and value, are part of the daily fabric of human conversation. The question can be put in another way. Does the absence of universal agreement, because really we make these judgments as if everyone's going to agree with us, and quickly find that almost everybody disagrees with you, right? So how do we deal with this paradox? Does the absence of universal agreement in aesthetic judgments demonstrate their lack of rationality? Or alternatively, do they convey another picture of rationality? In fact, one of the many accomplishments of Cavell's philosophy is to remap a series of relationships in epistemology where aesthetic discussion is investigated and revalued such that criteria of scientism no longer serve as the exclusive model for a reasonable conversation or a reasonable judgment. One of Kant's first steps in the critique of judgment is to observe in the Analytic of the Beautiful that because aesthetic judgments are grounded entirely in a subjective and personal voice, okay, we all give our judgments subjectively and personally, they can be neither objective, logical, or Kant says theoretical. The non-theoretical character of aesthetic judgments has a precise sense here. such judgments are singular and thus not generalizable. And in addition, Kant says they are unmediated by concepts. Aesthetic judgments have the peculiar character of asking for universal assent, even if we know that it cannot and will not be granted, at least universally. Does this mean that aesthetic judgments are irrational, since we cannot hope for universal consensus, and thus risk isolation and ridicule in making them? And what to make of Kant's assertion that aesthetic judgments are without concept? At the same time, Cavell takes Kant at his philosophical word, but without wishing to dissolve this paradox between the singular and the universal. For this paradox may be expressive of another power of great human value. That is, the power of aesthetic judgments is to be arguable, to provoke discussion, as if to say that the potential for disagreement is also the capacity for conversation and sociability. And there is another paradox to confront in our ordinary practices of expressing aesthetic judgments. One of Ludwig Wittgenstein's most important and difficult lessons in his philosophical investigations was to say that at some point, reasons are exhaustible. You've said all you can possibly say to justify your opinion. There will be moments when speech loses its force, hence Wittgenstein's frequent appeals to look and to see, which might be an appeal to the other to discover their own interpretation and their own concept or context, since mine seems to be at some point incommunicable. I just don't have any more to say about it except look, look at it, and see if we can find something else to talk about. This is a situation where reasons fail or find their limits, but in so doing, they don't become irrational. In examining the power of aesthetic judgments, Cavell does not seek to replace or overturn claims of scientific knowing. Rather, he finds in the grammar of aesthetic and evaluative conversations the bases, no matter how open-ended and contingent, for negotiating rational agreement in whatever domain, right? So it's about aesthetic conversations become a model for negotiating rational agreement. We'll come back to our feet. So what lessons can be learned about the grammar for reaching agreement and examining our conversations about art? The first lesson is to value the fact that aesthetic judgments are in principle inconclusive. They are open-ended and contingent, right? They are in principle inconclusive, and they are less open, if at all, to falsification than scientific claims. The scientific method must go forward by falsifying data, finding new data, falsifying hypothesis, finding new hypothesis. In other words, quantitatively speaking, in most scientific research, at some point, you will be right or you will be wrong. This goes all the way back to Plato, or Socrates rather, and Euphyro. There is no right and wrong in aesthetic judgments. You simply have to justify your thought about the work of art. In aesthetic conversation, there is no right or wrong about what I like or don't like, what I see or don't see, or what pleases me or doesn't. And at the same time, you may be inclined to argue that my judgments are ill-formed, incompletely expressed, or lacking a proper context or vocabulary, or that my judgment might be made more interesting by imagining a different context or new kind of comparison. Quite literally, in these situations, looking at the same image, you see something I don't see, right? In my view, might be limited and thus enlargeable, or yours might. And this brings me back to this painting that I knew very well, and was, if only we could be seeing it at the Art Institute instead of this projection. But you know, our first thing when we see these very strong images by Magritte is the paradox, of course, is the bare feet coming out of the leather shoe. And think about that as the kind of irony expressed by this painting. But, you know, as I thought about that in front of this image, I was with a colleague who was an expert on surrealism, and suddenly I began seeing more and more things. I mean, you think, when you see, you see. But suddenly, when you're talking to somebody else or have a new context, new details appear, like, why is there a burnt match there? Why is there a cigarette butt here? Maybe this is a tobacco paper. And then there's little coins on the ground. So it's as if now a whole new story emerges about this that you imagine of maybe somebody was standing there smoking a cigarette. Where did they go, right? And so in conversation with someone else, in establishing new context, in adding new contextual information to the image, new things become apparent, right? Your actual vision and understanding changes in the course of the conversation. Or someone might come up with information that says, that judgment's entirely wrong and you must start again. So I said there is no right or wrong in aesthetic conversation, only disagreement or agreement about the reasonableness of our interpretations and evaluations. You might hate Magritte for all I know, or I love Magritte. We'll have to have that conversation in a few minutes. What is asked for here is not assent to a conclusion, but rather a mutual seeking out of overlapping patterns of understanding and partial agreement. What Cavell learns from Kant is that in our enthusiasm for art, we may want to ask for universal assent, but we're willing to settle for arriving at and better understanding mutually held context for discerning consensus or agreement, no matter how tentative or fragile. Disagreement may also be valued as the motivation for further conversation, and coming to agreement does not necessarily mean assent to inescapable conclusions, but rather only reaching a partial and flexible accord supported by, again, a partial consensus. As importantly, in Artful Conversation, I discover something about myself, right, in talking to someone in an animated, disagreed way about art. For, as Cavell says, the problem of the critic, as of the artist, is not to discount his subjectivity, but to include it, not to overcome it in agreement, but to master it in exemplary ways. Patterns of disagreement are open to introspection and expressible in conversation, and can and should be further motivations to self-investigation and the achievement of greater expressive clarity. I can be asked, why do I think that way? And I have to go, because, and then I have to look within myself and solicit criteria for explaining myself better and understanding my relationship to the work of art and to my interlocutor. Cavell writes in a late essay, and a quote that I love very much, that I remain grateful to the artwork or art world objects for their still strange interest to me, and particularly, I think, for making me voluble, loosening my tongue, expressing myself. This is no small matter. So what Cavell means here, I think, is that one principal value of art is not just expression, but rather the power of inducing expressiveness in us. And this power, I believe, has an ethical force. One important procedure in ordinary language philosophy is recounting criteria. And I just gave you a good example of that, as being asked to say, if you say, I don't understand what you see in the red model, then I must search within myself and recount to you my criteria for finding interest in it, for liking it, why I think it's visually appealing, what kinds of conversations I think it should generate, and so forth. And here routes to consensus often take the form of projecting new contexts that open previously unforeseen semantic depths and complexities, as well as new possibilities for agreement. In asking and answering these questions of ourselves and others, we draw upon capacities of self-knowledge available to any speaker of language. And to draw upon and examine one's native competence as an expressive being is also to manifest often unspoken or implicit criteria guiding our interpretive and evaluative judgments. Philosophical investigation calls upon us to give voice to these criteria, to express ourselves, to display, recall, explore, and often criticize and revise them. And the value of these activities is that they bring us back to the terms of our alignment with others by specifying and clarifying what may count as specific matters of fact and value within the expressive community in which our artful conversations are taking place. In recounting our criteria in Artful Conversation, we gain greater understanding of how we know and why we value, right? So the conversations return us to, why do I think in this way? Why do I interpret this way? What are my grounds for interpretation? What are my criteria for valuing this work of art or not, as the case may be? And so it's a way of acquiring self-knowledge as well as alignment with another person. In acquiring and expressing knowledge of ourselves through making present and recounting our criteria for interpreting and valuing, we also acquire and give expression to our relations with others. To come to know one's own mind through interpretation is the path to knowing other minds, of discovering common ground in an interpersonal web of linked and linking criteria, vocabularies, concepts, and grammars of belief. The practice of introspective yet expressive self-examination is a way of weaving oneself into a community of others, because to acknowledge others is a way of recognizing oneself and opening oneself to acknowledgement by others. An innovation of ordinary language philosophy in this respect is its withdrawal, sorry, it's the Texan in me, the withdrawal from the quest for universal agreement. We don't need to reach a conclusion that's universally applicable. We can keep talking and arguing and examining ourselves. These practices are less concerned with convincing or conviction than with investigating and mapping the possibility of agreement, whole or partial, in a community whose scale and stability cannot be assured. Agreement must be continually solicited and negotiated, yet this process often fails. In fact, maybe it should be valued because it fails, such that the appeal to the grammar of ordinary language, which we all share, is not just a request for agreement, but also an investigation of our quotidian failures of communication and consensus and how we might overcome them. The claim to reason in aesthetic judgments therefore presents key features of how we reason in ordinary interpretive and evaluative conversations. Here, empirical evidence is in many cases irrelevant to one's assertions, though some such evidence may support them. Moreover, instances of disagreement are to be commonly expected. If aesthetic conversation lapses into disagreement, consensus will not be necessarily achieved by attempting to prove the other one wrong, or to prove yourself right, or to collect new data. Rather, in a spirit of rational accommodation, the conversation starts again in trying to understand why disagreement has arisen, perhaps by imagining novel examples or points of comparison. And then, if new points of consensus are found, to try to explain how this agreement has come about. Call this the search for alternatives, or testing through deployment of imaginative counterexamples the acknowledged and often unacknowledged assumptions, grounds, and context, or the not fully accounted for reasons underlying every expressive act. The critic's job is to try to achieve some confidence that the interlocutor will come to see or experience as she experiences, that one can join her in a special and fragile community of interpreters and values. Try to see what I see. Try to see as I see. And if you cannot, I can try to see as you see. We will try to give verbal expression to how these things can come together. It matters that others know what I see, Cavell writes. In a way, it does not matter. It matters that others see the way I see in a way that it does not matter whether they know my tastes. It matters because unless I can tell what I know, there is a suggestion, and to myself as well, that I do not know. But I do, Cavell says. What I see is that, pointing to the little burnt out match. But for that to communicate, you have to see it too. Describing one's experience of art, Cavell says, is itself a form of art. The burden of describing it is like the burden of producing it. I will try to wrap up now because I wanted to leave at least 15 minutes for discussion. But the final things I would like to say is that one of the great powers of aesthetic experience, of our experience together before an interesting work of art, is that aesthetic experience is incompletely communicable. There's no way we can say everything about it, or about what we see or don't see, or at least it should be more or less inexhaustible. And at the same time, in the conversations that we have about art, in which we have disagreements and try to elicit some consensus, I wanted to reassert the point that in asking me why I think the way I think, what I see, what I value, is how I value what I value, asks of me, myself, to return to myself in a process of introspection and to think about what the criteria were underlying those judgments I was making. And so aesthetic conversations are also a mode of discovering and displaying self-knowledge and communicating it to others. Broadly conceived, one might say that for all their messy methodological and multidisciplinary diversity, the humanities as such provide important laboratories for experimenting with creative procedures of interpretation, evaluation, and recontextualization. And in a similar way, aesthetic expression itself, in ways similar to aesthetic expression itself, the many forms of interpretive activity in the arts and humanities may introduce new conceptual schemes that reorient our understanding of artworks by making apparent, by making visible, neglected or overlooked features, offering new categories of intelligibility and comprehension, creating innovative frames of reference, and broadening our rhetorical resources. Interpretation might also respond to our ethical need to explore through art and aesthetic judgment important concerns of thought, feeling, and action. Our varied activities of interpretation, judgment, and evaluation thus offer occasions for criticizing, but perhaps also renewing and transforming possibilities of meaning and value. And so the takeaway I'm trying to give in the main second part of the talk is to say that the conversations about the visual arts, which are often difficult, which are incomplete, in which there are no right and wrong, can actually be seen as the model for all kinds of conversations we have across the humanities. With that, I'll conclude. I thank you for your attention, and I'm very happy to spend the next 15 minutes just answering questions or having conversation. Yes?
I wanted to ask you about how you think the aesthetic conversation is being conditioned by the free market.
Oh, yeah.
In particular, I'm thinking about when you talk to the gatekeepers, people like agents and producers, curators, oftentimes you'll find that what they appropriate is the language of the free market, where the reception of the work is equated with consumption.
Yes.
And so there's almost, and this I think goes all the way back into art school, where there is a continual need to figure out an algorithm that makes this acceptance of art.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if you can comment on how that aesthetic conversation is being affected by these kind of markets.
Yeah. I mean, one of the reasons why I do talks like this, and I have a book coming out next month called Philosophy's Artful Conversation, so this is a topic dear to my heart, is a way of trying to respond to this situation. And even within universities themselves, I mean, universities have to be, especially big research universities, have to be attentive also to this idea that in terms of how we talk about, let's call them aesthetic experience, artistic artifacts, is being increasingly invaded by a rhetoric of consumerism or commodification. Fortunately, again, there's less of it here than any place I've been, but I have been at more than one university. You talk about students as clients, for example, and how do you have deliverables in your lecture and stuff like that. And I mean, this is the hardest problem possible because on the one hand, there are fewer and fewer gatekeepers, which is social media give us more and more outlets for people to make judgments about art, good or bad, depending on your opinion of them. But having fewer and fewer gatekeepers and more discourse doesn't mean that it is thoughtful discourse, right? And so I don't want to argue for, more gatekeeping, but I would like to think in these kinds of conversations that each and every one of us can become better gatekeepers and editors of how those conversations take place. An example of this is last weekend there was a fantastic panel on art and public life that my colleague W.J.T. Mitchell organized with the Astor Gates over in the Logan Center. There was a terrific turnout for, especially from the community and not just academics. And the question arose that because people get talking about public art in Chicago and how people get on those committees and who they are representing. So we're talking about the gatekeepers for what gets funded as public art in Chicago. And the first mode of conversation was to talk about it making it as democratic as possible. And Tom Mitchell quite wisely said, well, if you have an entire community, much less the entire city of Chicago, vote on whether this piece of public art should go someplace, nothing's going to happen because there's going to be disagreement, which is one of my fundamental ideas. And Tom Mitchell and some other people on the panel actually made a sort of, let's call it a moderated defense of expertise. One can ask why the experts are selected to sit on panels. But at the same time, perhaps one does, in some cases, need experts. And a work of art that might seem controversial at one point in time might seem playful and fun and community building in another. It's always hard to make those judgments immediately. So I have no clear answer for your question. But the difficulty is about the role of gatekeepers. What criteria do they have? Is the only criteria for getting through the gate, or if you're in art school, is the only criteria for having a successful MFA show that a big New York gallery takes you up? Fortunately, the situation is more complex than that in the art world, and there's many young artists who aren't just going that route. But you've opened up probably the most complex question, and my response to it has been to do something which from some perspectives might look quite conservative, which is just go back and say, I don't make a claim for philosophy, I don't make a claim for English, I don't make a claim for Romance languages. In fact, it might be kind of weird that I make a claim for all of the humanities, but I'm actually just trying to step back because philosophers like to get to the ground of things and say, what are we doing when we interpret and when we evaluate? What do those conversations sound like? And what role do they play in our social lives? And in investigating those questions, to me, it becomes another way of reasserting the value of the humanities in the broader context of the research university. And so my sneaky plan, I have one dean here, is to say that in defending the visual arts in a research university also comes back around to saying, I'm trying to defend the humanities, the role of the humanistic education in a research university. I don't know if that was all satisfactory to your question, but it gave me the opportunity to deliver another sermon. So, yes, sir.
I haven't understood everything, but what strikes me in my own opinions about a piece of art is totally beautiful, but once you begin to try to explain why it's beautiful, you denigrate the beauty.
Gosh. Well, first of all, thank you, because if you didn't disagree with me, everything I would have said would have just fallen apart, right? But as a teacher, now speaking as a teacher, if I could not have a conversation with you in which we were both thinking about why we thought it was beautiful, and the work did not become more beautiful to you, then I would have failed as a teacher, right? So I actually do believe that having, investigating why you think something is beautiful and having to give reasons to others, and try to convince others that it is beautiful, is not only a way of investigating or understanding better why you find beauty in a work of art and being able to communicate that to your friends and interlocutors, But I would hope, because I'm doing this in the classroom all the time, that you yourself would actually have another experience, which the beauty of the work would be amplified, or at least more greatly appreciated in terms of how it was attained. So,
I'm only speaking of my own effort
yeah.
to verbalize
Yeah.
what just is so poor compared to the impression
Oh, yeah.
that I have. That's
Yeah.
the point. That's not to say that you
Yeah.
can't convince me to see the reasons why,
Yeah.
et cetera.
Yeah, but that was also a good example of what I said when I think that aesthetic experience is at some point incommunicable. You're going to fail on your efforts to explain why the work is so attractive to you. But I just think you shouldn't stop. You should go on. And you understood quite a bit, by the way. Yes.
What about the artist as a gatekeeper?
Yeah.
In this day and age, the artist has so much ability to express himself,
Yeah.
herself in the marketplace in any type of media that they wish to express
Yeah.
themselves in. And then that creates another hole. I mean, that's what the artist is saying about its work, but you may disagree.
Yeah.
Help you understand.
Yeah.
You may, I mean, that is so much more prevalent now
Yeah.
than it ever was.
Yeah. I mean, you're talking about in terms of the artists explaining their work or trying to contextualize it for themselves?
Explaining what they were getting at.
Yeah, yeah.
And sometimes it can be very, I mean, I think of Chuck Close as a good example.
Mhm.
And he was speaking at something, and I heard him speak. And this was a case where it was so helpful.
Oh, right, yeah.
You know, I'm a very, very facile artist. I can kind of replicate any style.
Yeah.
And that became a real burden to me because it was so easy to do that I was having a hard time finding my own
Yeah.
style. So I decided, what could I do to make it as hard on myself as possible to paint?
Yeah.
When he came up
Yeah.
with sort of all the grid and
Yeah.
all the different
Yeah.
complexities of what he does, which makes, instead of being facile, it makes it, very time-consuming
Yeah.
and
Yeah,
layer
yeah.
on layer and so on.
Yeah.
So, but I thought, oh, what a wonderful way to understand it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But in some cases, they're out there explaining it before you've ever had that chance. Your own visceral response
Yeah.
to it. And
Yeah, yeah.
not in that case,
Yeah.
but it can certainly happen.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it's a...
And they can influence, too, then, the teachers and the critics.
Yeah.
Listen to that.
Yeah.
Their kind of media presences.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's a complicated issue. I mean, I think in the case you described of Chuck Close, he's quite sophisticated in talking about his work. The beauty is that the artist has given you a new context to make visible aspects of his work that you may not have been attentive to, which is what we hope from any critic, not just the artists themselves. So first thing I want to say is we don't need to privilege the artist as the one who will give us that information. Maybe an art historian or an art critic could have given it to you as well. But the process comes out in the conversation. But the other thing you made me think about is that I think that it could be a good thing, it could be a bad thing. I tend to think it is a good thing, but one of the things that one gets, one aspect of art school training, it comes back to this question too, is the mode of the art crit, the art critique, right? Which has also become to fascinate me as a philosopher because I'm also a visual artist. I participate in critiques in the Department of Visual Arts here. And sometimes, we also have the image of the critique of a poor student along with two senior artists who are just going to, lam it into them. But, and actually, Jessica doesn't know this, but I actually gave a little presentation in a seminar on interpretation about the philosophical model of the art critique. Because Dova has a great model, which I think could be transported pedagogically in other domains. For the MFA critiques, I don't know whether it happens in the undergraduate critiques this way, all the faculty and all the students go to all the critiques. So there's a day when each of the MFA students, for example, have a work in progress installed. Everybody goes, and you have a conversation. And that interests me on a number of levels, one of which is my idea about aesthetic conversation being community forming, right? It's a temporary community, it comes together, it separates, but it brings together a community that might be temporary, but it's there. And it's a community built on working out patterns of agreement and disagreement, because nobody's going to walk in and go, that's great, A, go away. You know, there's some pretty intense conversations happen there with faculty disagreeing with other faculty and people changing their minds, which is as important. But the thing that fascinates me most about that experience is you have and the student also has to participate, right? They have to enter into the conversation. But the most interesting, one of the most interesting aspects for me is that you can be sitting with a given object or set of objects in the room, and we all walk in and talk. The artist will present it. We see it in one way, and we talk about it in different ways. And the more you talk about it, I mean, it's always the same thing, right? But the more you talk about it, suddenly it becomes visible in different ways. Some aspects drop away, new aspects come up. People from different places in the room notice different things, such that literally the quanta of information in the object that is visible to you is shifting constantly, because people are bringing up different opinions. Or maybe they say, well, I don't see that. But still you have to continue. And this idea that, you know, we were just not abstracting data from the object, the fact that the visibility and intelligibility of the art object is continually shifting through the process of conversation is actually a quite fascinating phenomena. So this is kind of a positive side of what you learn in art school around this idea of aesthetic conversation. Of course, you're learning about technique and mastering your craft and how to create artworks. But
when you're having this conversation, I mean, how many times does the artist sort of sit there and say, oh my God, I never thought of that and that?
oh, it happens.
Making it sound much better than it actually sounded to myself.
Yeah.
That happens more than anything else happens.
I know. And the great thing about it,
Thank you for having decided if I would work.
and the great thing about that, then later on they'll be invited to an artist talk and go, well, of course I was. So it'll be adopted as part of their presentation. So, but people probably have other things to go to at 10:30. I think, is that correct? Am I supposed to stop at 10:30? But yes, thank you all for coming. Much appreciated.